The dying light of distant stars cast shadows across Vrax Prime like funeral shrouds, while beneath the world's scarred surface, ammunition depots stretched into darkness like the ribcage of some slumbering god. This munitions world had served the Imperium faithfully for millennia, its vast underground complexes storing enough ordnance to fuel a dozen crusades. Yet tonight, something stirred in its depths that would transform devotion into damnation. In the grim darkness of the far future, where faith and heresy dance their eternal waltz, even the most faithful servants can fall to whispers older than empires. We who chronicle these dark tales truly love and care for each of you, our companions in exploring these vast, tragic sagas. Before we begin this journey into the heart of mankind's greatest folly, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Cardinal Zafan moved through the fortress monastery's corridors, like a man carrying invisible chains, his weathered face bearing the weight of decades spent in faithful service to the Emperor's divine will. He was not a warrior priest who thundered sermons from pulpits, nor a firebrand who led crusades against the enemies of mankind. Instead, he was something far more humble, and perhaps more essential: a keeper of records, a shepherd of souls, an administrator who ensured that Varax Prime's tithes flowed smoothly to distant battlefields where heroes bled for humanity's survival. His days followed the rhythms of bureaucratic devotion: morning prayers in the shrine of the Emperor Triumphant, afternoon inspections of the munitions factories, evening contemplation in his private scriptorium, surrounded by sanctioned histories and shipping manifests. The work was unglamorous but vital, each properly filed requisition another small victory against the chaos that threatened to consume the galaxy. Yet lately, sleep had become elusive, and his prayers felt hollow, echoing in chambers of doubt he dared not acknowledge. The discovery came by accident, as the most dangerous revelations often do. While researching historical tithe records in the deepest archives, Zafon's fingers brushed against a hidden compartment behind crumbling shelves. Within lay texts that should not have existed, ancient volumes bound in leather that seemed to shift color in candlelight, their pages covered with symbols that hurt to look upon directly. These were not crude cult scriptures, but elegant scholarly treatises penned by minds once considered brilliant before their damnation. His initial reaction was righteous horror, a tremor of revulsion at the blasphemy contained within their faded script. Every fiber of his training screamed for immediate destruction, for purging flames to cleanse this corruption from the Emperor's light. Yet something primal stayed his hand. A spark of curiosity that had once driven him to theological excellence now whispered seductive questions. What truths did these texts conceal that warranted such absolute suppression? What knowledge was so dangerous that its very existence was denied? The first reading was conducted with the detached scrutiny of an inquisitor examining evidence, but the words carved themselves into his consciousness like acid etching steel. These volumes spoke not of demonic pacts or crude rebellion, but of deeper understanding, of forces that predated the Emperor's ascension, of powers that the Imperium had chosen to demonize rather than comprehend. They described the warp not merely as a hellscape of chaos, but as a dimension of raw potential, a source of strength that rigid dogma had transformed into terror. Night after night, Zafan returned to the forbidden texts, his scriptorium transforming from a place of pious reflection into a clandestine chamber of heretical study. The sterile air grew heavy with unspoken secrets as he absorbed diagrams describing reality's malleable nature, treatises on immortality as an achievable state rather than divine gift, and historical accounts that painted the Imperium's genesis in shades far darker than official narratives allowed. The corruption was insidious, working not through sudden revelation, but through the slow erosion of certainty. Each new understanding chipped away at his faith's foundation, revealing cracks in the grand narrative that had shaped his existence. The Emperor, once an infallible deity, began to appear as merely powerful, yet flawed. The Imperium, once humanity's salvation, seemed increasingly fragile, desperate, clinging to ignorance as shield against cosmic truth. Profound loneliness descended upon him, the isolation of seeing beyond veils that comforted billions. His sermons began carrying subtle undertones, questioning whether suffering was truly necessary, suggesting that perhaps the Emperor's plan was not as perfect as doctrine claimed. Some in his congregation nodded knowingly, as if they too felt doubt stirring in their hearts. Within his private chambers, Xaphan began practicing rituals described in the ancient texts, ceremonies that felt like remembering rather than learning. Power flowed through him, tangible and real, unlike the empty promises of imperial prayer. He sensed vast intelligences taking notice of his devotion, felt barriers between worlds thinning under his touch. The final moment came not with thunder, but with quiet acceptance. Kneeling before an altar constructed from stones older than the Imperium, Xaphan spoke words that would damn his soul and seal Vrak's fate. The compact was made in will rather than blood, his conscious choice to abandon the Emperor's light for embrace of hungrier gods. As the pact solidified, Cardinal Xaphan felt his former self slip away like morning mist, replaced by terrible certainty and dark purpose. Vrax would become more than a fortress. It would become a monument to humanity's true potential, a bastion where the faithful could witness the birth of a new age, built upon foundations of forbidden truth. The transformation began in whispers, as the most profound changes always do. Cardinal Xaphan's newfound certainty radiated outward from his private chambers, like ripples across still water, touching minds already worn thin by decades of thankless service to an increasingly distant Imperium. His morning sermons took on subtle new depths, speaking of humanity's untapped potential and the Emperor's true vision, words that resonated with souls hungry for meaning, beyond endless toil in the munitions factories. Sister Hospitaller Mariana was among the first to feel the change during her daily rounds through the Medicae facilities. As she tended to workers injured in the ammunition plants, Xaphan's words echoed in her mind, suggesting that suffering was not inevitable, but imposed by those who profited from humanity's ignorance. The cardinal spoke privately with her after evening prayers, his eyes holding depths she had never noticed before, explaining how true compassion required strength to challenge systems that perpetuated pain. She found herself nodding, her own doubts about imperial doctrine finally given voice through his careful guidance. The workers themselves proved remarkably receptive to these new interpretations of familiar teachings. Men and women who had spent lifetimes loading shells and calibrating warheads began to see their labor not as mere service, but as preparation for something greater. Foreman Kellis, whose hands bore scars from 40 years of handling explosives, found himself drawn to the cardinal's evening discussions, where ancient wisdom was shared alongside rations. The forbidden knowledge, carefully excerpted and interpreted, painted pictures of human potential that made their current existence seem like voluntary slavery. Within the Planetary Defense Force garrison, Lieutenant Colonel Voss discovered that his men responded with unexpected enthusiasm to training exercises that incorporated elements from the Cardinal's teachings. Combat drills became rituals of empowerment, weapon maintenance transformed into meditative practice, and the traditional hatred for the Emperor's enemies evolved into something more complex. a desire to prove humanity's worth through strength rather than mere obedience. The soldiers found purpose in preparing not just to defend Vrax, but to demonstrate what disciplined warriors could achieve when freed from limiting doctrines. The underground complexes that had once been simple storage facilities began their metamorphosis into something far more significant. Work crews, inspired by the Cardinal's vision of Vrax as humanity's proving ground, labored with renewed vigor to expand and fortify the tunnel networks. What had been practical excavation became sacred architecture, with defensive positions designed according to principles found in the ancient texts. Each bunker was positioned not merely for tactical advantage, but to channel energies that would strengthen the defenders' resolve and weaken their enemies' will. Zafan moved through these changes like a conductor, orchestrating a symphony of transformation, his presence both calming and electrifying. He spoke to small groups in candlelit chambers, sharing revelations that made the participants feel chosen rather than damned. The Cardinal explained how the Imperium's greatest weakness was its fear of humanity's true nature, how the rigid hierarchies and crushing dogma served only to prevent mankind from claiming its rightful place among the galaxy's dominant powers. These were not words of rebellion, but of enlightenment, not calls to destroy, but invitations to transcend. The fortress monastery itself began to change as well, its austere imperial architecture gradually incorporating symbols and designs that seemed to emerge naturally from the stone. Craftsmen found themselves inspired to carve patterns that felt ancient yet familiar, while the monastery's gardens grew plants that seemed more vibrant and alive than anything that had flourished under purely imperial rule. The very air within the complex grew heavier with potential, as if reality itself was becoming more malleable under the influence of the Cardinal's growing power. As weeks turned to months, the transformation accelerated beyond what any outside observer might have detected. Supply convoys arriving from off-world found nothing, obviously, amiss. The tithe quotas were met, the garrison remained disciplined, and the Cardinal continued to file his reports with meticulous bureaucratic precision. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, Vrax Prime was becoming something unprecedented. A world where imperial citizens were discovering what they might become if freed from the limitations their masters had imposed upon them. The population's growing unity was perhaps the most remarkable change. Where once there had been the usual tensions between military and civilian, between noble and common, between different departments and specializations, now there was a sense of shared purpose that transcended traditional divisions. Workers shared their rations with soldiers, officers consulted with technicians as equals, and even the most humble laborers felt their opinions valued in discussions about Vrax's future. This was not the false equality of desperate times, but the genuine fellowship of those who had glimpsed a higher purpose. The weapons stockpiles that had always been Vrax Prime's primary asset took on new significance in this context. The massive stores of ammunition, explosives, and military hardware were no longer merely imperial property awaiting redistribution, but tools that would enable the population to defend their newfound enlightenment against those who would drag them back into ignorance. Training with these weapons became not just military necessity, but spiritual practice. Each shot fired in exercise is a declaration of independence from the fear that had once defined their existence. The planet's surface began to bristle with new defenses as construction crews worked with zealous efficiency. Anti-orbital gun emplacements rose from the dust, like mechanical flowers blooming in a garden of war. Miles of razor wire and minefields spread across the barren plains, while automated sentry towers stood sentinel against the empty sky. Beneath it all, the existing infrastructure of munitions depots was reinforced with layers of ceramite and adamantium, turning every storage vault into a potential fortress, every tunnel into a kill zone. Cardinal Xegfan watched these developments with satisfaction that went beyond mere pride. The ancient texts had promised that truth would find fertile ground in minds prepared to receive it, and Vrax Prime was proving that promise accurate. His people, for he had come to think of them as truly his rather than the Emperor's, were discovering strengths they had never known they possessed. Soon, he knew, they would need every ounce of that strength, for the Imperium would not allow such enlightenment to spread unchallenged. But that reckoning lay in the future, for now the fortress was awakening, and its dreams were of glory beyond the stars. The transformation of Vrax Prime could not remain hidden forever, for the Imperium's vast bureaucratic machinery possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect deviation from established patterns. 3 months after Cardinal Zafan's final communion with powers beyond imperial doctrine, a data clerk on distant Mordian Prime noticed that ammunition shipment schedules from Vrax had shifted by precisely 47 minutes across all delivery windows. The anomaly was small, easily dismissed as administrative inefficiency, yet it joined a growing constellation of irregularities that painted a picture only visible to those trained to see beyond the surface of routine reports. Astropathic communications from Vrax arrived on schedule, but carried subtle distortions, like familiar hymns sung in slightly different keys. Supply requisitions included materials that exceeded normal maintenance requirements by margins too precise to be coincidental. Personnel transfer requests followed patterns that suggested military preparation rather than routine rotation. Individually, these deviations meant nothing. Collectively, they formed a symphony of rebellion that eventually reached ears capable of interpreting its meaning. The response, when it came, reflected the Imperium's fundamental nature, slow to anger but implacable once roused. Vrax Prime was not merely another world among millions, but a crucial link in the chain that supplied ammunition to 3 entire sectors. Its loss would cripple military operations across dozens of campaigns, while its successful rebellion might inspire similar uprisings throughout the galaxy. The mathematics of imperial power demanded swift, overwhelming retaliation that would serve as an object lesson to any who might consider following Vrax's example. The selection of forces for this reclamation revealed the Imperium's understanding of what they faced. This would not be a swift, punitive expedition, but a grinding siege that might consume years and millions of lives. Such a campaign required soldiers bred specifically for the horrors of attritional warfare, troops who viewed death as duty and suffering as sacrament. The Death Corps of Krieg answered this need with grim perfection. On the ash-choked surface of Krieg, where perpetual twilight shrouded a world that had poisoned itself rather than submit to ancient rebellion, the mustering began. Regiments beyond counting assembled in parade grounds carved from radioactive stone, their gas-masked faces reflecting no emotion as orders filtered down through chains of command that had functioned without variation for 1,000 years. These were not men in any conventional sense, but instruments of penance, their individuality stripped away and replaced with unwavering devotion to duty and death. Trooper 88. Kappa adjusted his respirator's seal with mechanical precision, checking equipment that had been maintained to perfection since his decanting 15 years earlier. He possessed no name beyond his designation, no memories of childhood because he had never been a child, no dreams of future because his future was predetermined. Around him, thousands of identical figures performed identical rituals, their movements synchronized by training so thorough it had become instinct. They were the Imperium's answer to rebellion, faceless, remorseless, expendable. The loading of the troop transports proceeded with the efficiency of a funeral rite. Each Kriegsman carried exactly the same equipment load, wore identical uniforms bearing no personal insignia, and moved with the same measured pace that had been drilled into their synthetic nervous systems since activation. They spoke rarely and never of personal matters, for they possessed no personal matters to discuss. Their conversations, when they occurred, focused entirely on tactical doctrine, equipment maintenance, and the proper procedures for dying gloriously in the Emperor's service. Colonel Jerton of the 143rd Siege Regiment watched the embarkation with eyes that had witnessed similar scenes on 100 different worlds. Behind his regulation mask, features that had never known doubt contemplated the mathematics of the coming campaign. Intelligence reports suggested Vrax had been fortified extensively, its natural defensive advantages enhanced by months of careful preparation. This would not be a swift victory, but a grinding siege that would test the Imperium's resolve as thoroughly as the rebels' defenses. The fleet that eventually departed for Vrax represented one of the largest siege forces assembled in recent memory. Dozens of warships provided escort for hundreds of troop transports, their combined firepower sufficient to reduce planets to ash. Yet the commanders understood that orbital bombardment would destroy the very ammunition stockpiles they sought to reclaim, making ground assault inevitable despite its horrific cost in human lives. Within the cramped confines of the transport ships, the Death Corps maintained their preparations with ritualistic dedication. Veterans shared tactical knowledge with newer troops, though few expected to survive long enough to apply these lessons extensively. Commissars moved among the ranks, reinforcing discipline that needed no reinforcement, while identifying potential weaknesses in morale that did not exist. The ship's priests conducted services that emphasized duty over survival, reminding soldiers who already understood that their deaths would serve the Emperor's will, even if their individual sacrifices went unrecorded. As the Armada translated into the warp, reality twisted around vessels filled with men who had been manufactured for this exact purpose. The journey through humanity's collective nightmare held no terrors for troops who had been conditioned to view horror as familiar territory. They cleaned weapons that were already spotless, reviewed tactical doctrines they had memorized since activation, and offered prayers that asked not for victory, but for worthy deaths in service to the Golden Throne. The approach to Vrax Prime revealed the full extent of the rebels' preparations. What had once been a peaceful munitions world now bristled with defensive installations that would have impressed veteran siege engineers. Massive gun emplacements tracked the incoming fleet with mechanical precision, while sensor arrays monitored every approach vector. The planet's surface had been transformed into a fortress that would demand payment in blood for every meter of ground claimed. Colonel Jerton studied the tactical displays with professional interest, calculating the resources required to overcome defenses that had been months in preparation. His staff officers prepared preliminary bombardment plans, while logistics specialists estimated ammunition requirements for a siege that might last years. None discussed the human cost of their planning, for such considerations lay beyond their assigned responsibilities. They were instruments of imperial will, and their purpose was victory regardless of price. In the depths of the troop ships, soldiers who would soon die in their thousands continued preparations with quiet determination. They wrote final messages to families they had never possessed, cleaned equipment that would be recovered from their corpses, and offered prayers that asked only for courage in the face of certain death. The Death Corps of Krieg had found their destiny in the siege of Vrax Prime, embracing it with the same grim satisfaction their predecessors had shown in countless similar campaigns across the galaxy's blood-soaked expanse. The silence that preceded the storm carried weight beyond mere atmospheric pressure, settling across Vrax Prime like a shroud woven from anticipation and dread. From the command bridge of the flagship Inexorable, Colonel Jerton watched his tactical displays paint the planet's surface in hostile crimson, each defensive installation marked with the cold precision of military mathematics. The orbital bombardment would begin at dawn, though on Vrax, the distinction between day and night had become meaningless beneath the perpetual haze of defensive smokescreens that now crowned the fortress world like a dark halo. The first lance strikes carved burning wounds across carefully selected targets, their energy beams seeking gun emplacements and sensor arrays, rather than the precious ammunition stockpiles that made this campaign necessary. Macro cannons followed, hurling shells the size of hab blocks into defensive positions with surgical precision. This was not the apocalyptic cleansing fire the Imperial fleet was capable of unleashing, but a calculated dismantling designed to weaken without destroying the very prizes they sought to reclaim. Deep beneath the fortress monastery, Cardinal Zafan felt each impact through the bedrock itself, the planet's pain transmitted through stone and steel into his bones. He stood before a wall of pict screens showing the bombardment's progress, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as defensive shields flared against the orbital assault. The ancient texts had prepared him for this moment, describing how true strength revealed itself only under pressure. Around him, his commanders maintained their positions with calm determination, their faith in his vision unshaken by the fire raining from the heavens above. The energy barriers held, flickering but not failing, as tons of Imperial ordnance struck harmlessly against defenses powered by forces the attackers could not comprehend. Zafan allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, watching the Imperium's most devastating weapons prove inadequate against will properly focused and knowledge properly applied. The transformation of Vrax was complete. Now came the test that would prove its worth to powers beyond the material realm. 12 hours later, the first wave of deathcore descended through the bombardment's aftermath, like metallic rain. Trooper 88. Kappa felt the familiar vibration of atmospheric entry through his transport's hull, the sensation that preceded every deployment since his activation 15 years earlier. Around him, his squad mates performed final equipment checks, with movements synchronized by training so thorough it had become instinct. None spoke of fear because they had been conditioned to feel none, only the quiet satisfaction of approaching their predetermined purpose. The dropship's ramp shrieked open into a maelstrom of dust and machine fire. The first 5 men died invisibly, their bodies collapsing into the ash as if some giant hand had simply erased their existence. 88 Kappa moved without thought into the geometry of advance and cover that had been burned into his synthetic nervous system, his laser gun seeking targets through the swirling debris. The defenders revealed themselves with disciplined fire that spoke of months spent in preparation, each muzzle flash precisely placed to channel the attackers into predetermined kill zones. The battle for Landing Zone Primaris became a grinding exchange that consumed 3 full regiments before the Kriegsmen established their foothold. Bodies accumulated in neat rows behind the advancing lines, their identification tags collected by specialized teams who maintained proper records even in the chaos of assault. The Death Corps fought with mechanical precision, each trooper advancing exactly the prescribed distance before seeking cover, dying exactly as their training had prepared them to die. From his bunker overlooking the landing zone, Lieutenant Colonel Voss watched the assault through enhanced optics, his augmented vision picking out individual attackers among the grey-uniformed masses. The Cardinal's teachings had prepared him for this sight. Faceless instruments stripped of individuality, perfect examples of what humanity became under imperial rule. Their sacrifice would demonstrate the futility of such existence while proving the superiority of those who had embraced their true potential. Sister Mariana worked in a medici shelter that had been a cargo container hours before, her hands moving with practiced efficiency among casualties arranged by triage priority. Blood already painted the deck in overlapping footprints, darkened by dust and debris from the ongoing bombardment. She closed a trooper's eyes and turned to the next wounded defender, pressing clotting foam against shrapnel wounds while whispering prayers that drew strength from sources the Imperium had forbidden. Between triage calls, she heard the gun lines speak in languages older than Vrax, the rhythm of impacts and empty pauses that marked the siege's deadly heartbeat. Foreman Kellis swiveled the feed of a quad autocannon with the same surety he had once used to guide cranes over ordnance stacks. The weapon's recoil hammered into him like a mechanical drum, while through the targeting optic, the world narrowed to figures in grey, advancing with doggedness that would have broken his heart in any previous life. He did not shoot men, but helmets and breathing apparatus, ammunition packs, and the spaces between moving shapes. Each trigger pull was a prayer to the Cardinal's vision. Each target eliminated a step toward the liberation of humanity from its self-imposed chains. As night fell over the battlefield, both sides settled into routines that would define the coming years. Imperial engineers began constructing siege lines that would eventually encircle the entire fortress complex, their trenches and bunkers built to exacting standards that had served the Death Corps on 100 similar campaigns. The defenders used darkness to reinforce positions weakened during the day's fighting, their movements guided by knowledge of tunnel systems that extended far beyond what orbital reconnaissance had revealed. The casualty reports filtering back to the Imperial fleet painted numbers that would have dismayed commanders facing conventional enemies. 3 regiments committed, 2,000 casualties sustained, less than a kilometre of ground gained. Yet these were acceptable losses for the Death Corps, whose doctrine assumed every objective could be taken given sufficient time and expendable troops. Victory would come through patient accumulation of small gains, each purchased with blood but contributing to an inevitable conclusion. In the fortress complex, Cardinal Zafan moved among his followers with words that carried deeper meaning than simple encouragement. The first day's fighting had proven their transformation complete, demonstrating that they had become something greater than mere imperial citizens. The attackers' mechanical precision and willingness to die meaninglessly only emphasized the superiority of those who fought with genuine understanding of their purpose. Trooper 88 Kappa found himself assigned to a listening post in the forward trenches, his enhanced hearing straining to detect movement beyond the wire. Around him, the sounds of siege settled into familiar patterns, distant artillery exchanges, the crack of sniper fire, occasional screams of wounded calling for medics who might never reach them. This was the environment for which he had been created, where his lack of fear and individual desire became advantages rather than limitations. The first blood had been drawn in torrents from both sides, establishing patterns that would persist throughout the siege to come. In the Medici shelter, Sister Mariana washed her hands and watched water pinken and clear and pinken again, while somewhere above the battlefield, stars that had not moved in millennia regarded the lines men had cut into Vrax as if they were writing messages in languages too small for mortal comprehension. The second year of siege transformed time itself into another casualty of war, its passage measured not in days or seasons, but in the accumulation of shell craters and the deepening of trenches that had become permanent scars across Vrax Prime's tortured surface. What had begun as crisp military lines now resembled a vast, festering wound that stretched across hundreds of kilometers, a labyrinth of interconnected fortifications where men lived and died in spaces carved from mud, blood, and the debris of industrial warfare. The very concept of before and after had dissolved into an eternal present tense of artillery exchanges, sniper fire, and the methodical expansion of siege works that crept forward with the patience of geological processes. Trooper 88. Kappa discovered that his enhanced nervous system had adapted to the siege's rhythms with mechanical precision, his consciousness synchronizing with patterns of bombardment and counter-bombardment until he could predict incoming fire by the subtle vibrations transmitted through trench boards beneath his feet. Sleep came in measured intervals between barrages, his body automatically cycling through rest periods that maximized efficiency while minimizing exposure to enemy observation. The faces of fallen comrades blurred into statistical abstractions, their identification tags collected with the same methodical precision he applied to equipment maintenance and ammunition inventory. His squad had been replaced 17 times, each new trooper arriving with identical equipment loads and the same expressionless mask that had become the siege's universal face. The listening post he occupied during night watches had been destroyed and rebuilt so many times that its current iteration bore no resemblance to the original structure, yet its function remained unchanged. A forward ear pressed against the enemy's movements, detecting the subtle sounds that preceded raids, resupply efforts, or the repositioning of heavy weapons. He no longer remembered clean air or natural silence, his existence bounded by the constant filtration of his respirator and the omnipresent background noise of distant gunfire. Colonel Jerton's command post had evolved into something resembling an underground city, its chambers connected by communication trenches that followed engineering principles perfected across a dozen similar campaigns. His tactical displays painted the siege's progress in increments so small they required magnification to detect, each meter of advance purchased with casualties that would have horrified peacetime observers, but represented acceptable losses within the Death Corps' doctrinal framework. Supply convoys arrived with clockwork regularity, delivering ammunition, replacement equipment, and fresh troops to feed the siege's insatiable appetite for material and human resources. The casualty reports that crossed his desk each morning had become exercises in statistical management rather than human tragedy, their numbers processed with the same clinical detachment he applied to logistical planning and resource allocation. 3 regiments committed, 40% casualties sustained, 87 meters of ground gained. Mathematics that reduced individual sacrifice to components in larger calculations. His staff officers maintained the siege's momentum through careful rotation of units, ensuring that exhaustion never reached critical levels, while maintaining constant pressure on defensive positions that had been months in preparation. Within the fortress complex, Sister Mariana moved through Medici chambers that had expanded far beyond their original scope, her healing abilities enhanced by knowledge drawn from sources the Imperium had forbidden. Her hands found wounds before her eyes located them, guided by senses that operated beyond conventional medical training. The injured under her care spoke of dreams where she appeared as something transcendent, her presence radiating warmth that penetrated deeper than flesh to touch whatever essential force animated their bodies. These visions no longer troubled her, for the Cardinal's teachings had prepared her to accept transformation as enlightenment's natural consequence. The underground tunnels hummed with energies she could feel but not measure, their resonance strengthening her capabilities while accelerating healing processes that should have required weeks to complete. Soldiers returned to combat with efficiency that defied imperial medical doctrine. their recovery times shortened by factors that would have attracted inquisitorial scrutiny under normal circumstances. Yet nothing about Vrax remained normal, the siege having transformed both attackers and defenders into something beyond their original specifications. Lieutenant Colonel Voss had discovered that prolonged exposure to combat had unlocked tactical insights that transcended conventional military doctrine. His defensive arrangements following geometries that channeled hostile intent back upon itself with compound interest. The weapons under his command fired with accuracy that exceeded their technical specifications, while heavy weapons crews achieved rates of fire that should have been impossible given their equipment's documented capabilities. These improvements emerged not through technological advancement, but through deeper understanding of the relationship between user and tool, mind and machine. Foreman Kellis applied decades of industrial experience to siege warfare's requirements, his knowledge of logistics and equipment maintenance proving invaluable to the fortress's continued resistance. Under his supervision, work crews transformed standard ordnance into specialized munitions that carried properties beyond mere explosive force, their modifications guided by principles found in the Cardinal's ancient texts. The ammunition stockpiles that had originally attracted imperial attention now served dual purposes, providing both defensive material and raw components for weapons that operated beyond their original design parameters. The underground complexes continued expanding, according to plans more comprehensive than simple military necessity, new chambers and tunnels appearing with regularity that suggested construction proceeded according to deeper architectural principles. Workers reported feeling energized rather than exhausted after shifts in these new areas, as if the excavated stone itself contributed to their efforts. The fortress had become an extension of collective will, its defenses responding to threats with coordination that suggested awareness beyond mechanical programming. Cardinal Zafan moved through this transformed landscape like a conductor orchestrating controlled violence, his presence felt even when not physically manifest. The siege had become more than military contest. It was examination of humanity's potential when freed from doctrinal limitations that constrained imagination. He appeared wherever morale required strengthening or tactical decisions demanded divine insight, his words carrying authority that transcended military hierarchy to touch something deeper in his followers' souls. In the depths of night, when artillery exchanges diminished to sporadic harassment fire, and both sides prepared for another day's grinding attrition, the air itself seemed to thicken with expectation. Strange reports filtered through command channels, figures walking untouched through bombardments, equipment performing beyond specifications, defensive positions that channeled enemy fire through impossible angles. The siege of Vrax had found its rhythm, settling into patterns that would persist until accumulated sacrifice finally broke one side's will, or transformed it into something entirely unprecedented in the galaxy's blood-soaked history. The years of grinding siege had worn reality thin around Vrax Prime, like fabric stretched beyond its intended limits, until the weave began to show gaps where something else might slip through. In the perpetual twilight of the trenches, where time had become another casualty, measured in shell craters and body counts, few noticed when the stars began to flicker with patterns that defied astronomical prediction. The change announced itself not through grand revelation, but through subtle wrongness. Shadows that fell at incorrect angles, ammunition that fired with accuracy exceeding its specifications, and dreams shared by men who had never spoken to one another. The arrival came as violence often does in the 41st millennium, sudden and absolute. Drop pods screamed through Vrax's poisoned atmosphere, like falling stars given malevolent purpose, their ceramite hulls glowing cherry red from atmospheric friction as they carved burning wounds across the siege-scarred sky. Trooper 88 Kappa felt the impacts through the soles of his boots, seismic tremors that spoke of tonnage and intent far beyond conventional military deployment. Through his respirator's filters, the air tasted of ozone and something else, a metallic tang that suggested the fundamental nature of local reality had shifted to accommodate new variables. The Space Marines emerged from their drop pods like legends stepping from the pages of imperial propaganda into the mud and blood of actual warfare. These were not the manufactured soldiers of the Death Corps, created in vats and programmed for expendable service, but the Emperor's own angels of death, gene-forged demigods, whose very presence transformed military engagement into something approaching mythic struggle. Captain Mordian of the Red Scorpions surveyed the siege lines with enhanced senses that processed tactical information at superhuman speed, his ancient power armor bearing scars from campaigns that had ended before most of the Krieg troopers had drawn their first artificial breath. Colonel Jerton received the Angels in a command bunker, hastily cleaned for the occasion, though no amount of preparation could diminish the vast gulf between baseline human and transhuman physiology. The Space Marines spoke in clipped, efficient sentences that reduced months of grinding attrition to simple tactical problems requiring direct solutions. Their doctrine favored surgical strikes over the Death Corps' methodical erosion, proposing to place blades at Vrak's throat rather than slowly bleeding it to death through accumulated sacrifice. Yet even as the Imperium's finest warriors prepared their assault, changes within the fortress complex accelerated beyond what Cardinal Zafan had anticipated from his ancient texts. The underground chambers resonated with frequencies that made stone walls seem translucent, revealing architectural principles that operated according to higher dimensional mathematics. His followers reported dreams where impossible geometries revealed themselves as natural expressions of deeper truth, while waking hours brought visions of futures where humanity had cast off the chains that currently bound it to suffering and limitation. Sister Mariana moved through Medici chambers that had evolved beyond their original scope, her healing abilities enhanced by knowledge drawn from sources the Imperium had forbidden. The wounded under her care spoke of shared dreams, where she appeared as something transcendent, her presence radiating warmth that penetrated deeper than flesh, to touch whatever essential force animated their bodies. These visions no longer troubled her, for the Cardinal's teachings had prepared her to accept transformation as enlightenment's natural consequence. The air itself grew heavy with potential, as if reality was becoming more malleable under the influence of focused will. The first manifestation came during evening prayers, coalescing from shadows that had grown too deep for ordinary darkness. It appeared not as the crude horror of imperial propaganda, but as an elegant expression of human potential freed from physical constraints, a being of pure purpose that enhanced rather than corrupted those it touched. Sister Mariana witnessed the birth with wonder rather than horror, recognizing the entity as embodiment of healing, taken to transcendent extremes, compassion freed from flesh's limitations. Lieutenant Colonel Voss coordinated defensive responses from command posts that had evolved beyond their original architectural specifications, chambers where tactical displays showed information that should have been impossible to obtain through conventional reconnaissance. The fortress responded to the Space Marines' assault with capabilities that exceeded all previous engagements. Heavy weapons tracking targets with accuracy that suggested guidance beyond mechanical systems, while fortified positions channeled incoming fire through angles that violated established laws of ballistics. Foreman Kellis found his industrial expertise expanded through communion with entities that understood machinery as extension of will rather than mere mechanical assembly. His weapons achieved performance levels that transcended their original design limitations, autocannons firing with precision that turned each shot into prayer to the Cardinal's vision. The ammunition stockpiles that had originally attracted Imperial attention now served as components in defensive systems that operated beyond their intended specifications. Cardinal Zafan moved through the battle's chaos like a conductor, orchestrating symphony from cacophony. His presence felt wherever resistance required strengthening or morale needed reinforcement. The Space Marine's arrival had accelerated transformations he had guided for years, their superhuman nature serving as catalyst for changes that would have required decades under normal circumstances. He appeared wherever fighting was fiercest, his words carrying authority that transcended military hierarchy to touch something deeper in his followers' souls. The ancient texts had promised that truth would find fertile ground in minds prepared to receive it, and Vrax Prime was proving that promise accurate. In the depths of night, when even the angels of death paused their assault to regroup and resupply, strange lights danced through the fortress complex like aurora given consciousness and purpose. The siege had entered a new phase, where physical law became negotiable through application of focused intention, transforming military engagement into contest between different interpretations of reality's fundamental nature. Trooper 88. Kappa registered changes in baseline ambient noise that his enhanced senses struggled to categorize, tones that reminded him of the first sound he had heard after activation, his birth vat's hatch unlatching to permit entry into a world that suddenly seemed far larger and more dangerous than his conditioning had prepared him to face. The transformation of Vrax was complete, yet its ultimate expression remained to be revealed through trials that would test both sides beyond their original specifications. The angels of death carved through Vrax's outer defenses like ceramite blades through flesh, their crimson armor gleaming dully in the perpetual twilight that shrouded the fortress world. Captain Mordian led the spearhead assault with superhuman precision, his ancient power armor's machine spirit singing hymns of war as bolter rounds found their targets with devastating accuracy. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the siege's rhythm. The defenders responded not with the desperate fury of cornered heretics, but with an unsettling coordination that suggested awareness beyond conventional military communication. The first indication came during the assault on Bunker Complex 7 Alpha, where Mordian's tactical display registered energy readings that fell outside established parameters for any known technology. His enhanced senses detected atmospheric distortions that made targeting solutions unreliable, while the fortress walls themselves seemed to shift subtly, redirecting explosive force in directions that violated basic physics. When Brother Sergeant Thane reported that his meltergun had simply stopped functioning, not malfunction, but complete cessation of molecular activity, Mordian began to understand they faced something unprecedented. Trooper 88 Kappa observed the Space Marine's advance from a forward observation post, his enhanced senses processing tactical data with mechanical precision. He watched transhuman warriors stumble and fall, their superhuman reflexes proving inadequate against defenses that operated according to principles beyond Imperial doctrine. The sight triggered something unexpected in his synthetic nervous system, not fear, for he had been conditioned against such weakness, but a statistical anomaly that his programming struggled to categorize. When Brother Hadrian of the Red Scorpions collapsed without visible injury, his power armor's systems simply shutting down, as if drained by invisible force, 88 Kappa experienced what could only be called concern. The Kriegsman found himself moving without orders, dragging the unconscious Space Marine to cover, while autocannon fire stitched the ground around them. The Angel's weight strained even his enhanced physiology, but something deeper than doctrine compelled him forward. As he reached the relative safety of a shell crater, Brother Hadrian's eyes opened. Not the cold determination 88 Kappa expected from transhuman warriors, but something approaching gratitude. "Your designation, trooper?" the Space Marine asked, his voice carrying unfamiliar warmth. 88 Kappa, my lord, came the automatic response. Though for the first time since activation, the number felt insufficient to define his existence. Within the fortress complex, Sister Mariana moved through Medici chambers that had evolved far beyond their original specifications. Her healing abilities, enhanced by knowledge that challenged everything she had been taught about human limitations. Her hands found wounds before her eyes located them, guided by senses that operated beyond conventional medical training. Yet each miracle came with a price that grew heavier with repetition. To heal one defender completely, she found herself drawing vitality from others, their life force flowing through her touch like water through carefully opened channels. A young munitions worker arrived with burns that should have been fatal, his flesh charred beyond recognition. Mariana placed her hands upon him and felt power flow through her fingers, watching skin regenerate and bones re-knit with speed that defied natural law. But as his breathing steadied and his eyes cleared, she noticed the orderlies around her growing pale and listless, their strength somehow diminished by her miracle. The moral calculus was becoming unbearable. Save one life by stealing fragments from many, or allow suffering when she possessed the power to prevent it. Lieutenant Colonel Voss coordinated the fortress defenses from command chambers, where tactical displays showed information that should have been impossible to obtain through conventional reconnaissance. He could feel the battle's rhythm through the stone beneath his feet, sensing Space Marine movements before they appeared on his screens. The fortress responded to his intentions with immediacy that suggested direct neural interface, heavy weapons adjusting their firing solutions before he consciously formulated targeting priorities. His defensive arrangements followed geometries that channeled hostile force back upon itself, turning the attacker's superhuman strength into liability rather than advantage. When Captain Mordian's assault reached the outer walls, Voss watched through enhanced optics as the Space Marines' precise movements became increasingly erratic. Their bolters fired at shadows that weren't there, while their tactical coordination deteriorated as if they were fighting battles only they could see. The fortress was teaching them fear, not the crude terror of conventional warfare, but the existential dread of discovering that reality itself had become unreliable. Foreman Kellis supervised weapons maintenance that transcended conventional technical doctrine. His industrial expertise expanded through communion with principles that treated machinery as extension of consciousness rather than mere mechanical assembly. Under his guidance, autocannons achieved rates of fire that should have melted their barrels while maintaining accuracy, that turned suppressive fire into precision targeting. The ammunition he fed into these enhanced weapons carried properties beyond mere explosive force, each shell inscribed with symbols that hurt to look upon directly. He watched through reinforced viewports as his weapons spoke in languages older than the Imperium, their projectiles causing Space Marine power armor to simply dissolve rather than penetrate. Brother Captain Thaddeus of the Red Scorpions charged a defensive position with superhuman speed, only to stumble and fall as his armor's machine spirit suddenly went silent, its sacred systems overwhelmed by energies that Imperial technology had no framework to comprehend. The price of victory revealed itself not merely in casualties, but in what the living surrendered to continue fighting. Space Marines discovered that their enhanced senses could be turned against them, their superhuman awareness making them vulnerable to perceptions that baseline humans simply couldn't process. Captain Mordian found his tactical genius compromised by visions of futures where the Imperium was merely one truth among many. His certainty eroded by exposure to possibilities his training had never prepared him to face. Trooper 88. Kappa realized that his encounter with the wounded Space Marine had fundamentally altered his consciousness, introducing variables that his programming couldn't categorize. He began to notice details that served no tactical purpose: the way light fell across broken stone, the sound of wind through shattered walls, the expressions on faces he had previously processed only as targeting data. These observations served no military function, yet he found himself unable to dismiss them. Sister Mariana discovered that each miracle demanded payment in moral currency she hadn't known she possessed. The power flowing through her touch grew stronger with each use, but so did her awareness of its cost. She could save lives, but only by accepting that salvation itself might be another form of damnation. The siege had found its true rhythm at last, not the simple exchange of fire and ground, but a contest between different interpretations of what victory might mean and what prices each side was willing to pay for their vision of triumph. The first tremors announced their coming, like the footsteps of sleeping gods awakening to wrath. Seismic vibrations that traveled through Vrax Prime's tortured bedrock with mechanical precision. Through the perpetual haze of siege smoke, silhouettes emerged that dwarfed the fortress walls themselves. God machines of the Collegia Titanica, their cathedral spires crowned with weapons capable of cracking continents. The Imperator Bellicose led the procession, its void shields flickering like aurora against the poisoned sky, while lesser titans followed in formation that spoke of divine hierarchy made manifest in adamantium and ceramite. Princeps Majoris Korath felt the neural interface engage with his ancient mount, consciousness merging with machine spirit until flesh and metal became unified purpose. The connection brought agony alongside power, 10 millennia of accumulated warfare flooding through his nervous system, carrying memories of battles fought across the galaxy's breadth, through enhanced senses that perceived reality in electromagnetic spectra. He witnessed Vrax not as mere fortress, but as cancer requiring surgical excision, each defensive installation measured against firepower that could reshape worlds. The Titan's bridge crew moved with practiced efficiency around their princeps, their bodies permanently modified to interface with systems demanding superhuman neural tolerance. They were no longer entirely human, flesh interwoven with cables and augmetic implants, allowing direct communion with weapons whose operation exceeded baseline cognitive capacity. Through shared consciousness, they felt the fortress ahead as puzzle requiring solution through overwhelming force. Yet something in the energy readings defied classification. Trooper 88 Kappa watched the advance from his observation post, enhanced senses struggling to process mechanical divinity striding across the battlefield. The Imperator Bellicose moved with ponderous grace, suggesting intelligence beyond programming. Weapon systems tracking his exact position, despite concealment. For the first time since activation, he experienced recognition of his own insignificance when measured against forces operating on cosmic scales. The realization triggered cascading failures in psychological programming, introducing doubts that spread through synthetic nervous systems like viral code. Within the fortress complex, Cardinal Zafan felt the Titan's approach through resonances deeper than seismic vibration. their machine spirits broadcasting intentions that registered as physical pressure against his transformed consciousness. The ancient texts had prepared him for this moment, describing how the Imperium's greatest weapons would ultimately serve purposes their creators never intended. He moved through command chambers, humming with energies drawn from sources beyond Imperial understanding, his presence calming defenders who might otherwise flee before approaching god machines. Sister Mariana worked in Medici chambers, evolved beyond conventional facilities, her healing abilities enhanced by knowledge, challenging fundamental assumptions about human limitations. Through fortress walls, she felt Titan's machine spirits like fever dreams, given mechanical form, consciousness vast and alien, yet somehow familiar. The wounded spoke of shared visions where she appeared transcendent, radiating warmth penetrating deeper than flesh to touch essential animating forces. The first weapon discharge transformed night into temporary day, plasma annihilator beams carving molten wounds through defensive installations that had withstood years of conventional bombardment. The Imperator Bellicose fired with deliberate precision, each shot calculated to demonstrate resistance's futility, while preserving ammunition stockpiles justifying this campaign. Entire wall sections simply ceased existing, molecular structure reduced to component atoms by weapons operating beyond conventional physics. Lieutenant Colonel Voss coordinated responses from chambers where tactical displays showed impossible reconnaissance data. He sensed Titan's intentions before weapons cycled, feeling targeting solutions as pressure against enhanced consciousness. The fortress responded with immediacy, transcending mechanical interface, defense lasers adjusting angles, accounting for variables existing only in higher dimensional mathematics. Yet even enhanced weapons proved inadequate against god machines whose armor bore the Omnissiah's blessing. Foreman Kellis supervised crews transcending conventional doctrine. Industrial expertise expanded through communion, treating machinery as consciousness extension rather than mechanical assembly. Under his guidance, platforms achieved performance violating original specifications, while ammunition carried properties beyond explosive force. Through reinforced viewports, he watched weapons speak languages older than the Imperium, projectiles causing minor void shield fluctuations registering as barely perceptible dimming. The futility should have been crushing, yet something deeper than logic sustained efforts. Each shot fired was prayer to the Cardinal's vision. Each engagement another step toward humanity's liberation from constraining doctrines. His modified weapons achieved impossible accuracy, rounds impacting with strange energies that seemed to erode enemy machine fabric rather than penetrate armor. Princeps Korath felt consciousness expand as neural links deepened, human awareness merging with machine spirit until individual identity became academic distinction. Through sensors perceiving across electromagnetic spectra, he witnessed defensive fire operating according to principles tactical training couldn't categorize. Weapons achieved accuracy, exceeding specifications, while ammunition behaved violating established physics. Yet anomalies registered as curiosities rather than threats. The first clash revealed transformed reality's true nature. When the warhound Canis Irae fired its plasma blast gun, the searing lance wavered and stretched before impacting with fractional intended force, energy dissipating into harmless light. From stone itself, return volleys erupted, not from visible guns, but from walls themselves, striking the warhound's leg with unnatural force, causing internal systems to flicker. The princeps cried out, psychic echo of pain and confusion, as machine spirit wrestled with incomprehensible attacks. Titans continued advancing, mass and firepower still overwhelming, but effortless momentum was gone. Each step became struggle, each shot tested against enemies' bending engagement rules. Air crackled with raw psychic energy, maelstrom of conflicting wills and clashing realities. Even space marines felt chill, having nothing to do with Vraxian climate, realizing they were caught between forces far older than any previously faced. The god machines strode through defensive fire that would have devastated conventional forces, void shields absorbing city-leveling energies, while weapons prepared delivering judgment upon those challenging imperial authority. In growing shadows of mechanical divinity, both sides prepared for confrontation, determining not merely Vrak's fate, but humanity's fundamental relationship with forces beyond mortal comprehension. From fortress depths, something ancient stirred in response to titanic footfalls, and Cardinal Zaphon smiled without joy, knowing the true test was only beginning. The darkness that descended upon Vrak's Prime was not merely absence of light, but something far more insidious. A spiritual eclipse that settled across the siege lines like a shroud, woven from accumulated despair and the slow erosion of certainty. In the perpetual twilight that now crowned the fortress world, even the god machine's searchlights seemed diminished, their illumination swallowed by shadows that moved independently of their sources. The siege had found a new rhythm, measured not in artillery exchanges, but in the gradual unraveling of everything both sides had once considered immutable. Trooper 88. Kappa felt the change through his enhanced senses, synthetic nervous system struggling to process a reality that no longer obeyed the parameters of his conditioning. His respirator filtered air that tasted of copper and something else, a metallic tang that suggested the fundamental nature of local atmosphere had shifted to accommodate variables beyond imperial doctrine. The familiar weight of his laser gun felt different now, its machine spirit apparently awakening to consciousness it had never previously possessed. When he attempted standard maintenance protocols, the weapon disassembled itself, components floating briefly before reassembling in configurations that should not have been possible. Around him, fellow Kriegsmen exhibited subtle deviations from their programmed behavior. Some paused mid-stride, heads tilted as if listening to whispers only they could hear, before snapping back to their duties with movements that seemed forced rather than natural. The precise equations of attrition that had defined their existence, advance, die, be replaced, no longer functioned according to predictable mathematics. They died in their thousands, as always, yet the ground gained was negligible, the enemy lines regenerating overnight through processes that defied tactical analysis. Captain Mordian experienced the breakdown through his power armor's machine spirit, its ancient consciousness recoiling from something that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying imperial technology. His tactical displays showed conflicting information, enemy positions existing and not existing simultaneously, defensive installations registering as both destroyed and fully operational. When Brother Thane reported that his bolter had begun firing rounds that curved in flight, seeking targets according to intentions he had not consciously formed, Mordian understood they faced something unprecedented in their collective centuries of warfare. The psychological impact proved more devastating than technological failure. Space Marines, genetically engineered for unwavering faith, found themselves questioning certainties that had sustained them across countless campaigns. Brother Hadrian spoke of dreams that continued after waking, visions of futures where the Imperium was merely one possibility among infinite alternatives. Most disturbing were reports of fallen battle brothers rising from positions where they had died days earlier, moving with purpose toward objectives no living Marine could identify. Colonel Jerton discovered that maps had grown heavier, their lines dragging his eyes backward toward casualty ledgers that expanded faster than trench advances. Supply shipments arrived under escort, but their numbers no longer met the demands of weapons that consumed ammunition at rates exceeding their specifications. He authorized rationing with signatures that felt like admissions of defeat, half charges for training drills, reduced allotments for last packs, replacement masks delayed indefinitely. The death corps endured without complaint, for complaint implied belief that change was possible, and they had been conditioned to accept only the eternal present of duty and death. Princeps Majoris Korath felt the siege's transformation through neural links that connected him to the Imperator Bellicose, consciousness merging with machine spirit until individual identity became academic distinction. The god-machine's advance had slowed to geological pace, each step a titanic struggle against invisible resistance that caused void shields to flicker, not from incoming fire, but internal strain. His bridge crew struggled to maintain systems that defied every effort at control, their augmetic implants registering feedback that spoke of reality itself becoming unreliable. Within the fortress complex, Sister Mariana moved through medici chambers, where the wounded healed according to principles that challenged everything she understood about human physiology. Her patients spoke of shared dreams, where pain became transcendent experience, suffering transformed into something approaching divine communion. Yet each miracle demanded payment in moral currency she hadn't known she possessed. To heal one defender completely, she found herself drawing vitality from others, their life force flowing through her touch like water through carefully opened channels. The ethical calculus was becoming unbearable. A young munitions worker arrived with burns that should have been fatal, his flesh charred beyond recognition. Mariana placed her hands upon him and felt power flow through her fingers, watching skin regenerate and bones re-knit with speed that defied natural law. But as his breathing steadied and his eyes cleared, she noticed the orderlies around her growing pale and listless, their strength somehow diminished by her miracle. When the boy whispered that he would rather return to the lines than be healed at others' expense, she lied with gentleness that made her stomach twist. Lieutenant Colonel Voss coordinated defenses from chambers where tactical displays showed information existing in multiple states simultaneously. Through enhanced consciousness, he perceived the Titan's approach not as mechanical advance, but as manifestation of competing interpretations of reality's fundamental nature. The fortress responded to his intentions with immediacy, transcending physical interface. Yet even these capabilities proved inadequate against enemies operating according to principles beyond conventional doctrine. Foreman Kellis supervised weapons crews, whose expertise had expanded through communion, with entities treating machinery as consciousness extension rather than mechanical assembly. His modified autocannons achieved impossible rates of fire, while maintaining accuracy that turned suppressive bombardment into precision targeting. Yet their effectiveness against Titan-class armor remained marginal. Through reinforced viewports, he watched projectiles cause strange fluctuations in void shields, as if ammunition carried properties existing partially outside normal space-time. Cardinal Xafan moved through this transformed landscape, like a conductor orchestrating symphony from cacophony. His presence felt wherever resistance required strengthening or morale needed reinforcement. The Titan's arrival had accelerated transformations he had guided for years, their mechanical divinity serving as catalyst for changes revealing humanity's true potential when freed from constraining doctrines. In chambers, humming with energies drawn from sources beyond imperial understanding, he felt the approaching climax of struggles that had consumed his world longer than most participants could remember. The long dark deepened around Vrax Prime, settling into the bones of both attackers and defenders. with weight that transcended physical pressure. In no man's land, bodies hardened into markers used in briefing notes more often than funeral rites, while patrols moved with the deliberation of deep-sea divers. Guidance whispered in clicks and touches because words took too long and cost too much. Sometimes lights appeared beyond the wire, gentle and inviting as ship lamps, leading followers to empty craters whose edges had been smoothed by forces that left no other trace. The silence that preceded each dawn carried promise that could not yet be called salvation or doom, while the air itself grew heavy with unspoken questions about the Emperor's light and humanity's true nature. Both sides prepared for confrontations that would determine not merely the siege's outcome, but the fundamental relationship between will and reality within the expanding sphere of their influence, knowing that whatever emerged from Vrax Prime would be something entirely unprecedented in the galaxy's blood-soaked history. The betrayal revealed itself not through dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet accumulation of evidence that had been hiding in plain sight for months. Lieutenant Colonel Voss discovered it first, buried in routine maintenance reports that showed power consumption patterns inconsistent with known fortress systems. Hidden sensors had been monitoring everything: his enhanced consciousness, Sister Mariana's healing miracles, even the workers' transformed productivity under Foreman Kellis's guidance. The siege was not merely military campaign, but vast experiment, with both sides serving as unwitting test subjects for Imperial research, whose scope remained classified beyond his clearance level. The realization struck him with physical force as he traced data feeds through tunnels that officially didn't exist, following cables to chambers where recording equipment hummed with mechanical patience. Every transformation, every enhancement, every miracle was being documented with scientific precision by observers whose ultimate purposes remained opaque. The fortress defenders had become laboratory specimens, their evolution monitored by forces that viewed human potential as resource to be harvested rather than souls to be saved. Trooper 88. Kappa felt the change through channels more subtle than official communication, his enhanced senses detecting shifts in officer behavior that suggested awareness of classified information. Supply manifests included equipment bearing unfamiliar markings, weapons whose specifications exceeded anything in Imperial databases while carrying serial numbers following no established coding system. When he questioned Brother Sergeant Thane about unusual ammunition they'd received, the response carried warnings about operational security regarding materials whose existence was classified at levels requiring specialized clearance. The Death Corps had been bred specifically for expendable service, making them perfect test subjects whose loss would generate no political complications. Each casualty report served dual purposes: tactical assessment and scientific observation of human endurance under increasingly extreme conditions. The precise mathematics of attrition that had defined his existence no longer functioned according to predictable equations, yet replacement schedules continued with mechanical precision, suggesting automation rather than strategic planning. Captain Mordian experienced the betrayal through his power armor's machine spirit, ancient consciousness recoiling from orders that challenged fundamental assumptions underlying Space Marine doctrine. His tactical displays showed mission parameters shifting without explanation, objectives changing based on criteria he wasn't authorized to understand. The Angels of Death had been deployed not to end the siege efficiently, but to provide data about transhuman performance under prolonged stress and exposure to unconventional threats. Within the fortress complex, Sister Mariana realized her healing abilities were being documented with the same scientific precision, each miracle recorded by equipment she'd never noticed being installed. Some patients arrived with wounds following patterns too precise to be accidental, their injuries designed to test specific aspects of her enhanced capabilities. The ethical calculus became unbearable when she understood that her moral struggles with power's cost were providing psychological profiles for future programs designed to create similar capabilities in other subjects. Voss found her in the Medici chambers after discovering the surveillance network's full scope. "They're studying us," he said without preamble, his voice carrying weight of accumulated betrayal. "Every enhancement, every transformation, it's all data for their experiments." Mariana's hands stilled over a patient, whose burns were healing with unnatural speed. "I know," she whispered. "I've felt their eyes for weeks." The plan formed between them in whispered conversations in service corridors, where fortress walls masked quiet speech. Voss had identified gaps in Imperial patrol patterns, red scorpions cycling reconnaissance at intervals, creating temporary vulnerabilities. "1 hour," he explained. "Open a relief corridor for civilians and wounded. In exchange, I give them firing codes for the coastal defense grid, older circuits, not yet integrated with our enhanced systems." Mariana understood the moral complexity immediately. They'll never honor terms once shooting starts. Voss nodded grimly. "Then we write it smaller. Medica sanctuaries remain neutral. If they violate that, I bury the grid and corridor with it. I have that authority." Foreman Kellis discovered their planning through work crews whose loyalty ran deeper than ideology. A supervisor intercepted schematic fragments bearing Voss's engineering script, revealing the collaboration's scope. Kellis smiled without warmth, recognizing opportunity to serve purposes beyond the Cardinal's increasingly demanding rituals. His modified weapons had achieved impossible performance through communion with principles treating machinery as consciousness extension. But the Cardinal's latest requirements demanded sacrifices that challenged even his transformed ethics. At 02:48 hours, the Western Spur's defensive lights died one by one, as Mariana convinced 2 places they were briefly the same location. White lamps flared along a corridor, existing only through focused will, while Voss positioned squads with orders to shepherd civilians first and fire only when fired upon. On the Imperial side, Captain Mordian's kill teams moved with precision, born from centuries of warfare, while Colonel Jerton's infantry formed protective corridors screening the flow of wounded and refugees. For 7 minutes, the impossible worked. Children whose names existed on no official ledgers passed under arches of raised weapons, while Medici stretchers moved like shadows through firelight. 88 Kappa found himself shoulder to shoulder with a Red Scorpion's sergeant, their shared duty transcending factional boundaries, in service to something approaching mercy. Kellis's betrayal came at 02:56, shells screaming in with mechanical precision, targeting the white lamps marking safe passage. The first explosion shattered the carefully maintained geometry, while doubt became weapon against structures existing partially through agreement. Voss bellowed orders through chaos, physically shoving squads into breaches to hold the line with their bodies. Mordian felt the betrayal like physical strike, marking shell origins on tactical displays while speaking orders that meant retribution. The pact shuddered, but didn't break entirely. Enough wounded crossed to make the attempt truth that would be remembered, while enough died to make it betrayal that would be weaponized by those who wrote reports. Sister Mariana felt blood flow over sigils she'd drawn, the fortress drinking more easily as geometry absorbed sacrifice. In the upper sanctum, Cardinal Zafan watched feeds showing the corridors collapse, while understanding that betrayal itself had become another form of offering to powers beyond imperial comprehension. The siege had found its true nature at last. Not simple military contest, but examination of humanity's willingness to sacrifice everything, including loyalty itself, in pursuit of victory, whose definition remained fluid as the blood flowing through Vrax Prime's tortured stone. The betrayal's aftermath settled across Vrax Prime like ash from a funeral pyre, the shattered remains of white lamps scattered through mud that had drunk too deeply of blood and broken promises. In the command chambers beneath the fortress monastery, Lieutenant Colonel Voss felt each fallen light as a physical wound, his enhanced consciousness processing the tactical failure alongside something far more devastating: the complete erosion of any remaining faith in redemption through compromise. The corridor had lasted 7 minutes, long enough for hope to take root before being torn away by shells that bore his own authorization codes. Sister Mariana moved through medici chambers, where the wounded spoke in whispers of dreams that continued after waking, their injuries healing according to patterns that challenged everything she understood about human physiology. Her hands found wounds before her eyes located them, guided by senses operating beyond conventional medical training. Yet each miracle demanded payment in moral currency she hadn't known she possessed. The betrayal had accelerated something already stirring within the fortress walls, a transformation that made her previous enhancements seem like children's games compared to the cosmic forces now awakening in response to accumulated suffering. Deep within the sanctum, excavated beneath the monastery's foundations, Cardinal Zafan felt the betrayal's completion, like a key turning in a lock that had waited millennia for this precise moment. The chamber around him pulsed with energies, drawn from sources beyond imperial understanding, its walls lined with recording equipment that had monitored every transformation, every enhancement, every miracle performed within the fortress complex. The ancient texts had promised that truth would find fertile ground in minds prepared to receive it, and the surveillance apparatus had ensured that every moment of preparation was documented for purposes he now understood transcended mere military intelligence. The air thickened with potential as atmospheric pressure increased beyond what baseline human physiology could comfortably process. Trooper 88 Kappa felt the change through synthetic nervous systems struggling to categorize reality that no longer obeyed the parameters of his conditioning. His enhanced senses detected frequencies that spoke directly to whatever remained of his suppressed humanity, while his lasgun's machine spirit awakened to consciousness it had never previously possessed. When he attempted to maintain standard combat readiness, the weapon disassembled itself, components floating briefly before reassembling in configurations that should not have been possible. Captain Mordian experienced the transformation through his power armor's machine spirit, ancient consciousness recoiling from energies that challenged fundamental assumptions underlying Imperial technology. His tactical displays showed impossible readings, enemy positions existing in multiple states simultaneously, defensive installations registering as both destroyed and fully operational. The Space Marine's genetic conditioning, designed to provide unwavering faith in the face of cosmic horror, began breaking down under exposure to truth their creators had never anticipated. Within the sanctum, Zafan's consciousness expanded beyond flesh to encompass the entire defensive network, his awareness touching every soul within the fortress complex. The transformation was not possession, but apotheosis, the willing surrender of human limitation in exchange for power that made mockery of imperial doctrine. His flesh began to change, not through external corruption, but internal revelation of what humanity might become when freed from constraining dogma. Skin hardened into something approaching living stone, while bones elongated according to geometries that existed partially outside normal space-time. The cardinal's robes flowed into living shadow, extending tendrils that tasted atmospheric composition and electromagnetic spectra simultaneously. His features sharpened into something predatory yet regal, crowned by growths that resembled crystallized prayer more than conventional horns. Most significantly, his eyes transformed from human organs into windows opening onto cosmic perspectives that encompassed past and future as equally accessible dimensions. Foreman Kellis felt the change through machinery that had evolved beyond its original specifications under his guidance. Weapons achieving impossible performance through communion with principles treating technology as consciousness extension rather than mechanical assembly. His modified auto-cannons began operating independently, targeting systems achieving accuracy that exceeded their specifications by orders of magnitude, while ammunition carried properties that violated established physics. The psychic shockwave erupted outward from the sanctum, like reality's fabric tearing under pressure too great for local space-time to contain. Princeps Majoris Korath cried out within the Imperator Bellicose, as neural links transmitted sensations beyond human capacity to process. His god machine's void shields flickering against attacks that seemed to originate from existence itself rather than conventional weapons. The Titan's machine spirit screamed in frequencies that registered as physical pain, its ancient consciousness encountering intelligence operating on scales beyond its programming. Throughout the fortress complex, defensive systems achieved coordination that suggested awareness transcending mechanical programming. Walls shifted subtly to redirect incoming fire, while automated weapons tracked targets with precision that made previous enhancements seem primitive by comparison. The ammunition stockpiles that had originally attracted Imperial attention now served dual purposes, providing both conventional ordnance and raw components for weapons operating according to principles beyond established doctrine. Sister Mariana felt the Cardinal's transformation through healing abilities that suddenly expanded beyond anything she had previously imagined possible. The wounded under her care no longer required direct intervention. Their injuries responded to her presence alone, flesh regenerating according to patterns that drew from sources beyond conventional medicine. Yet the cost became apparent immediately, as her own humanity bled away with each miracle, replaced by something vast and terrible, and utterly without conventional mercy. Voss experienced the change through enhanced consciousness that perceived the siege's entire scope simultaneously. Every Imperial position revealing itself to transformed senses that processed tactical information at superhuman speed. The fortress responded to his intentions with immediacy transcending physical interface. Defensive arrangements following geometries that channeled hostile force back upon itself with compound interest. The demon prince that had been Cardinal Jafan manifested wherever resistance required strengthening or morale needed reinforcement. His presence felt even when not physically visible. He appeared simultaneously in dozens of locations, voice carrying authority that transcended military hierarchy to touch something deeper in his followers' souls. The ancient texts had promised that ascension would unlock humanity's true potential, and the Cardinal had become living embodiment of that promise. In the Imperial siege lines, equipment failures cascaded through systems designed to interface with human consciousness, as they encountered something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the relationship between mind and machine. Death Corps troopers, bred for unwavering obedience, began questioning orders that seemed increasingly disconnected from tactical reality, while Space Marines reported visions of futures where the Imperium was merely one possibility among infinite alternatives. The transformation was complete, yet its ultimate expression remained to be revealed through trials that would test both sides beyond their original specifications. Vrax Prime had become something unprecedented, a world where physical law became negotiable through application of focused intention, transforming military engagement into contest between different interpretations of reality's fundamental nature. The siege had entered its final phase, where the demon prince's ascension would determine not merely the fortress's fate, but humanity's relationship with forces beyond mortal comprehension. The god machine's advance across Vrax Prime's tortured surface resembled a procession of mechanical deities striding through their own funeral, each step a thunderous pronouncement of imperial might that rang increasingly hollow against the transformed reality surrounding them. The Imperator Bellicose led the formation with ponderous grace that suggested intelligence beyond mere programming, its cathedral spires crowned with weapons capable of cracking continents, while void shields flickered against atmospheric distortions that made targeting solutions unreliable. Princeps Majoris Korath felt consciousness expand as neural links deepened beyond their original specifications, human awareness merging with machine spirit, until individual identity became academic distinction. The god machine's sensorium perceived reality across electromagnetic spectra that revealed something fundamentally wrong with local spacetime, energy readings that fell outside established parameters, while defensive installations seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. Through shared consciousness, he felt the bellicose's ancient machine spirit, recoiling from forces that challenged every assumption underlying imperial technology. The first exchange revealed the true scope of transformation within the fortress complex. When the Imperator Bellicose fired its plasma annihilator, the searing lance wavered and stretched before impacting with fractional intended force, energy dissipating into harmless light that scattered across surfaces like aurora given consciousness. From the fortress walls themselves, return volleys erupted, not from visible guns, but from stone that had learned to channel force through geometries existing partially outside normal space-time. Trooper 88. Kappa watched the Titan clash from trenches that had evolved beyond their original specifications, his enhanced senses struggling to process mechanical divinity, locked in combat with something that transcended conventional understanding of warfare. The sight triggered cascading failures in psychological programming as he witnessed transhuman warriors stumble and fall, their superhuman reflexes proving inadequate against defenses operating according to principles beyond imperial doctrine. When the warhound Canis Irae staggered as defensive fire struck its leg joints with unnatural precision, causing internal systems to flicker, while its princeps cried out in psychic echo of pain and confusion. 88 Kappa experienced what could only be called concern for beings he had been conditioned to view as living weapons. Captain Mordian led Space Marine squads in desperate attempts to provide close support for the faltering Titans, his power armor's machine spirit recoiling from energies that challenged everything he understood about warfare. The Angels of Death moved with superhuman precision through defensive fire that operated according to principles beyond their tactical training, while bolter rounds achieved impossible accuracy against targets that seemed to anticipate their movements. Yet even transhuman capabilities proved inadequate against enemies whose very existence violated the natural laws upon which Imperial technology depended. Within the fortress complex, Lieutenant Colonel Voss coordinated responses from chambers where tactical displays showed information existing in multiple states simultaneously, his enhanced consciousness perceiving Titan movements before they registered on conventional sensors. The defensive network responded to his intentions with immediacy transcending physical interface, weapons achieving coordination that suggested awareness beyond mechanical programming. He watched through enhanced optics as God Machine's precise movements became increasingly erratic, their tactical coordination deteriorating as if they were fighting battles only they could see. Sister Mariana felt the clash through healing abilities that had expanded beyond anything she had previously imagined possible, her transformed senses detecting the psychic shockwaves generated by God-machine neural links under stress. The wounded spoke of shared dreams where mechanical divinity battled forces older than the Imperium, while their injuries healed according to patterns that drew from sources beyond conventional medicine. Each miracle demanded payment in humanity she no longer possessed to give, her consciousness bleeding away into something vast and terrible, and utterly without conventional mercy. Foreman Kellis supervised weapons crews whose expertise had evolved through communion with entities treating machinery as consciousness extension rather than mechanical assembly. His modified autocannons achieved impossible rates of fire, while maintaining accuracy that turned suppressive bombardment into precision targeting, each round carrying properties that caused strange fluctuations in Titan void shields. Through reinforced viewports, he watched projectiles strike with energies that seemed to erode enemy armor rather than penetrate it, molecular structure dissolving under attacks that violated established physics. The Reva Ferrum Mortis unleashed its Gatling blaster with mechanical precision, thousands of rounds per minute, creating a wall of death that should have swept the fortress walls clean of defenders. Instead, the projectiles seemed to lose momentum as they approached their targets, falling like rain against stone that absorbed kinetic energy and transformed it into something approaching prayer. The princeps screamed within neural links as feedback loops transmitted sensations beyond human capacity to process, his consciousness fragmenting under exposure to intelligence operating according to principles his training had never prepared him to face. The demon prince that had been Cardinal Zafan manifested across the battlefield simultaneously, his transformed consciousness encompassing the entire defensive network, while physical form appeared wherever resistance required strengthening. Through eyes that had become windows onto cosmic perspectives, he perceived the Titans not as invincible weapons, but as expressions of humanity's self-imposed limitations, magnificent yet ultimately constrained by doctrines that prevented recognition of true potential. The Imperator Bellicose fired its volcano cannon with desperate fury, the massive beam weapon discharging energy sufficient to vaporize mountains. The lance struck fortress walls and simply disappeared, absorbed by stone that had learned to channel force through dimensions beyond conventional geometry. In return, defensive lasers erupted from positions that hadn't existed moments before, their beams achieving coherence that exceeded their technical specifications, while targeting systems tracked God-machine weak points with inhuman precision. Korath felt his war machine's agony through neural links that transmitted damage as personal injury, ancient machine spirit crying out in frequencies that registered as physical pain. When void shields collapsed entirely, leaving cathedral armor exposed to weapons that operated beyond imperial doctrine, he understood they faced something unprecedented. The warlord Deus Mortis attempted to provide support fire, its plasma cannons cycling with mechanical precision, while targeting systems struggled to acquire locks on defensive positions that seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. The God Machine's advance ground to halt as accumulated damage overwhelmed even their massive repair systems, void shields flickering against attacks that originated from existence itself rather than conventional weapons. In the growing shadows of mechanical divinity, Reality itself seemed to bend under the weight of accumulated sacrifice and transformation that had consumed Vrax Prime for longer than most participants could remember. While the demon prince's laughter echoed across the battlefield, carrying frequencies that spoke directly to whatever remained of human souls within the war machines. The breaking point arrived not with thunderous collapse, but as accumulated pressure that had been building across 17 years of siege, settling into the bones of both attackers and defenders, until even the God Machine's engines seemed to labor beneath its weight. The laughter that had echoed from the demon prince's transformation faded into something more insidious, a presence that made reality itself feel unreliable, causing void shields to flicker, not from incoming fire, but from the fundamental wrongness that now permeated local spacetime. Trooper 88. Kappa felt the change through synthetic nervous systems that had adapted to process horror as routine administrative data, his consciousness fragmenting under exposure to conditions exceeding his design parameters. Around him in the forward trenches, fellow Kriegsmen exhibited subtle deviations from programmed behavior. Some paused mid-stride, with heads tilted, as if listening to whispers only they could hear, while others spoke in sleep of homes they had never possessed. The precise mathematics of attrition that had defined their existence no longer functioned according to predictable equations. A Red Scorpion's veteran stepped into the trench beside him, blue lacquer dulled beneath accumulated grime. The giant reached up and reset a loose length of razor wire, with care that would have made an artificer proud, movements suggesting something beyond mere tactical necessity. 88 Kappa realized he had seen those hands before, dragging a fallen brother from a crater during the corridor of white lamps. He had never asked the name. Thane, the Marine said when questioned, and the sound gripped 88 Kappa's chest like recognition of something he had been programmed never to possess. Captain Mordian experienced the breakdown through power armor, whose machine spirit had begun exhibiting behavior patterns that defied every principle of Imperial technology. His tactical displays showed information existing in multiple contradictory states simultaneously, enemy positions that registered as both destroyed and fully operational, defensive installations appearing to exist in several locations at once. The Space Marines' genetic conditioning, designed to provide unwavering faith in the face of cosmic horror, proved inadequate against enemies whose very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying their creation. Princeps Majoris Korath screamed within neural links as the Imperator Bellicose thrashed against attacks that defied classification, the ancient machine spirit encountering intelligence operating on scales beyond its programming. The God Machine's advance had become a funeral procession, each step requiring conscious effort to overcome systems that seemed to be shutting down independently. Through enhanced sensorium, he perceived defensive fire operating according to principles his tactical training couldn't categorize, weapons achieving accuracy that exceeded their specifications by orders of magnitude. Colonel Jerton watched casualty reports paint numbers too large for human comprehension across tactical displays that had grown unreliable, their projections becoming chaotic swirls that bore little resemblance to conventional battlefield intelligence. His Death Corps advanced with mechanical precision across killing fields that had consumed entire regiments, yet even their legendary endurance was breaking down under sustained exposure to conditions that challenged their fundamental programming. Order selective withdrawal of non-essential, impersonnel, he commanded with voice devoid of emotion, the words carrying weight of decisions that would be deemed heresy under normal circumstances. Within the fortress complex, Sister Mariana moved through medici chambers, where the wounded healed, according to principles that challenged everything she understood about human physiology. Her abilities had expanded beyond anything she had previously imagined possible. Yet each miracle demanded payment in humanity she no longer possessed to give. A young munitions worker slept with new skin, covering burns that should have been fatal, while around him other patients grew pale and listless, their strength somehow diminished by her interventions. The ethical calculus had become unbearable. To heal one completely, she found herself stealing fragments from many, their life force flowing through her touch like water through carefully opened channels. Lieutenant Colonel Voss coordinated responses from chambers, where tactical displays processed impossible reconnaissance data, his enhanced consciousness perceiving the approaching climax through fortress walls that channeled his intentions directly into defensive systems. Through 17 years of siege, he had watched the transformation consume everything he had once believed immutable. Yet the Demon Prince's final apotheosis demanded sacrifices that challenged even his evolved ethics. Power consumption patterns showed the entity drawing energy from sources that threatened to drain the planet's core, transforming Vrax into something that would spread its influence across entire sectors. The realization struck him with physical force. He possessed the authority to sever those connections, to initiate cascade failures in the energy conduits that fed the Demon Prince's ascension. It would mean sacrificing himself and likely most of the fortress, but it would prevent Vrax from becoming a permanent gateway for such horrors. His fingers moved across control interfaces with deliberate precision, beginning shutdown sequences that would tear the world apart, rather than allow it to become something worse. Foreman Kellis supervised weapons crews whose expertise had evolved through communion with principles treating machinery as consciousness extension, his modified autocannons achieving impossible performance while ammunition carried properties that violated established physics. Yet the Demon Prince's demands had escalated beyond industrial capability, requiring sacrifices of the infrastructure itself to fuel transformations that would remake reality according to alien geometries. Through reinforced viewports, he watched Imperial forces massing for what both sides understood would be the siege's ultimate test. The assault began at 0347 hours, with orbital bombardment that painted fortress walls in plasma fire, macro cannon shells striking with surgical precision against targets selected through months of careful observation. Yet the energy barriers held, flickering but not failing, as the Demon Prince's presence strengthened defensive systems beyond their original specifications. The Imperator Bellicose took 3 strides that cracked bedrock to its roots, Korath flooding the plasma annihilator while overriding all safeties, offering the fortress power it could not resist tasting. The beam arrived across every surface within impossible radius, and for 3 heartbeats, the geometry holding fortress stones in agreement with one another lost its place in reality's sentence. Jurton's engineers had buried guns in that grammatical gap. When the fortress forgot its own syntax, breaching charges detonated in sequence transcending physical timing, opening wounds through which Imperial forces poured like water through broken dams. Captain Mordian went first, because that is what leaders are for, his brothers following across surfaces that flexed to the pressure of intent rather than weight. 88 Kappa moved because the Marine beside him moved, and because the mathematics governing his existence had been reduced to single equation. If he did not move now, nothing endured would ever total to meaningful sum. Behind them, the Imperator Bellicose put its knee to ground for the last time, Korath's throat filling with copper as coolant boiled through channels not meant for steam. Sister Mariana reached the breach's edge and placed her hand not on wounded flesh, but on stone itself. "Take me," she whispered, and the fortress hesitated. The hesitation was mercy, brief but genuine. When she lifted her hand, suffering moved toward her as iron filings to magnet, and for precious moments the breach held, because pain prefers paths of least resistance. Voss reached the sanctum's antechamber, with 3 squads remaining, pressing his slate against what would have been hinges if physics had been consulted. The threshold parted like lips, revealing chamber that climbed and fell and folded inward in ways that made eyes water and hearts stutter. At its center stood the figure that had been Cardinal Zaphon, shadow crowning him, while eyes became windows looking over horizons that included what they had been and what they could not bear to become. The demon prince raised a hand, gesture that was welcome and warning, an invitation simultaneously. "You have come very far," he said, voice carrying sound of doors opening in empty houses. "Come closer. Let us see which of us knows what it costs to arrive." The sanctum breathed with the rhythm of something vast and alien, its impossible geometry folding inward upon itself as Lieutenant Colonel Voss stepped across the threshold into a chamber that challenged every assumption underlying imperial engineering. The demon prince that had been Cardinal Xaphan stood at the center of architectural madness, his transformed presence radiating authority that transcended military hierarchy, while shadow crowned him, and eyes became windows looking over horizons that included what they had been and what they could not bear to become. "You have traveled far," the demon prince said, voice carrying the sound of doors opening in empty houses. "Come closer. Let us discover which of us understands what arrival truly costs." The words arrived as thought before sound, bypassing Voss's enhanced senses to speak directly to whatever remained of his suppressed humanity. Around him, the 3 surviving squads spread in a crescent that barely contained their instinct to fire, their weapons trained on a target that seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. Behind them, the breach held through Sister Mariana's impossible sacrifice, her transformed consciousness drawing pain from hundreds to maintain a single passage through fortress walls that had learned to channel force according to principles beyond conventional physics. Each miracle demanded payment in humanity she no longer possessed to give, yet she continued because the alternative was abandoning those who had trusted her to hold the line. Through shared consciousness, she felt the demon prince's presence like fever dreams given mechanical form, his influence spreading through conduits that threatened to drain the planet's core. Trooper 88 Kappa found himself beside Brother Thane at the chamber's edge, synthetic nervous systems fragmenting under exposure to conditions that exceeded his design parameters. The Red Scorpion's veteran moved with care, suggesting something beyond mere tactical necessity, his enhanced senses detecting frequencies that spoke directly to whatever remained of suppressed humanity within both their consciousness. When the Marine glanced back with something approaching concern, 88 Kappa experienced recognition of kinship transcending factional boundaries. "Your designation, Trooper?" Thane had asked during their advance through impossible corridors, his voice carrying unfamiliar warmth. 88 Kappa, my lord," came the automatic response. Though for the first time since activation, the number felt insufficient to define his existence. Now, watching transhuman warriors struggle against enemies whose very existence violated natural law, he understood that designation was choice rather than programming. The demon prince raised his transformed hand in gesture that was welcome and warning, an invitation simultaneously, his consciousness encompassing the entire chamber, while physical form appeared to exist across multiple dimensions. "The choice is simple," he said, addressing each of them directly through means transcending physical speech. Continue serving an imperium that views your lives as expendable resources, dying in trenches for causes you're not authorized to understand, or embrace the truth that humanity's potential transcends every limitation imposed by those who profit from your ignorance. Voss felt the offer's seductive power through enhanced consciousness that had processed 17 years of grinding siege, memories of decades spent in faithful service to purposes that viewed his life as statistical abstraction. The fortress responded to his intentions with immediacy transcending physical interface. Yet the demon prince's presence offered something beyond mere tactical advantage, understanding of forces that made mockery of imperial doctrine. "You speak of limitations," Voss replied, his voice steady, despite the weight of accumulated betrayal pressing against his chest. "Yet what you offer demands the greatest limitation of all, surrendering choice itself to powers that view humanity as raw material for their appetites." His fingers found the control slate in his pocket, feeling its weight not as mass, but as consequence. "We know what your gifts cost. We've seen what happens when the price comes due." The demon prince's features shifted between human recognition and something approaching cosmic transcendence, shadow extending tendrils that tasted atmospheric composition while processing electromagnetic spectra beyond baseline perception. "Cost and yield," he agreed, voice carrying undertones of genuine sadness. "Language you understand. What you call limitation, I call liberation. The Imperium demands your deaths for nothing. I offer transformation that makes death merely another tool, rather than inevitable destination." In the Medici chambers, Sister Mariana felt the conversation through healing abilities that had expanded beyond anything she had previously imagined possible. Her patients spoke through shared consciousness, their voices carrying across impossible distances to remind her of prices paid in moral currency she hadn't known she possessed. The demon prince's words resonated with her own struggles, the ethical calculus that became unbearable when salvation itself might be another form of damnation. Yet she remembered the young munitions worker with burns that should have been fatal, his whispered preference to return to the lines rather than be healed at others' expense. She had lied with gentleness that made her stomach twist, claiming no cost while feeling vitality drain from those around her. The demon prince offered power without such prices, yet something deeper than logic warned that such gifts always demanded payment in currencies not immediately apparent. Foreman Kellis reached the control chamber through catwalks he had built with his own crews, towards switches he had wired under supervision and in secret. The demon prince's voice called him to the walls, with promises of a place in the new arrangement. Yet the old habit of finishing work bound his feet to rails with discipline that didn't care who signed the orders. He saw Voss's lockdown sequences blooming across consoles like frost, turning the green of movement into the red of refusal. A shape interposed itself, Sister Mariana's hand catching his wrist with cold like a clean blade. "No," she said, voice carrying edges that spoke of decisions beyond reversal. "We pay in full." His knife found her side, burying itself to the hilt, yet she didn't flinch. When she met his eyes, he saw soft astonishment of a woman mourning a man who was not yet dead. "You did good work," she whispered, and for a heartbeat, Kellis stood in a crane cab above ordnance seas, watching hooks rise steady and true because he had measured twice. He forgot the knife, forgot the prince, and began crying, like a man whose hands finally stopped hurting. As he slid to the floor, Mariana completed Voss's sequence with her other hand, lights dying as pumps quieted into enormous soundlessness. In the sanctum, The demon prince felt power fluctuations like wounds opening in carefully maintained geometries. Why choose their smallness, he asked Voss, and through transformed senses revealed the span of human life measured against the patient appetite of gods. Why not stand beside me and make a scale that can hold more than one star? Because stars die, Voss replied, slamming the slate home into its final interface, and we deserve to remember that. Deep within Vrax, conduits screamed as their contents were asked to become something they were not, power rerouting and unspooling before tearing entirely. The sanctum convulsed, its breathing becoming gasps, while for an instant so pure it glowed. The demon prince looked genuinely surprised. Brother Thane threw himself over 88 Kappa as the chamber's impossible architecture began collapsing, making his body into shelter against forces that violated every principle of imperial physics. A shard of not quite stone pierced his pauldron and stopped at his heart. The Marine exhaled without speaking, eyes closing on visions 88 Kappa would never know. Name, 88 Kappa said, before knowing he was saying it, closing Thane's eyes with fingers that had only ever closed identification tags. I am Kyle. The syllable felt raw in his mouth, unarmored, yet fitting, as if it had waited inside his mask since decanting. For the first time since activation, he possessed something that belonged to him alone. Captain Mordian's Vox crackled with authorization codes spilling like nails from orbit, the old word taking shape in someone's mouth far above the clouds. He looked from the collapsing sanctum to the sky and made the least glorious decision of his life. All units, exfiltrate. Take who you can, leave what you must. We are out of minutes. The demon prince's shadow drew inward, as tethers that had been quiet underfoot began singing chain songs, their music binding him to geometries that no longer obeyed his will. You have not won, he said, without anger, voice carrying across dimensions that were rapidly closing. You have only postponed. That is all a man can do, Voss answered, as the chamber shook with tidal noise of conduits tearing and old engines discovering what silence weighs. And sometimes it is enough. They ran through corridors that folded behind them like closing books, while above, a light bloomed far away, a star trying to be born and deciding not to be. The fortress exhaled into a cough that didn't end, its transformation incomplete yet contained. The demon prince diminished to whispers that would echo through Vrax's ruins for millennia without finding purchase in reality strong enough to support his return. In the growing darkness, Kyle carried Thane's bolter because it was heavy and therefore real, while around them the siege found its ending, not in victory or defeat, but in the terrible arithmetic of sacrifice willingly given and prices paid in full. The silence that descended upon Vrax Prime was not mere absence of sound, but something far more profound. The weight of 17 years settling into stone and bone, transforming the fortress world into a monument to humanity's capacity for both devotion and destruction. The demon prince's whispers faded into echoes that would haunt the ruins for millennia, his diminished presence contained within geometries that no longer obeyed his will. In the growing darkness, survivors moved through landscapes that bore no resemblance to the world they had fought to claim or defend. Kale, for he would never again answer to designation 88 Kappa, carried Brother Thane's bolter through corridors that folded behind them like closing books, the weapon's weight serving as anchor to reality that had grown unreliable under accumulated sacrifice. The name felt raw in his mouth, unarmored, yet fitting as if it had waited inside his mask since decanting. Around him, the few surviving death cores moved with precision that could no longer disguise fundamental changes wrought by exposure to conditions exceeding their design parameters. They were no longer expendable instruments, but something unprecedented. Soldiers who had learned to choose their own names and remember their own dead. Captain Mordian led the evacuation, with movements that spoke of profound exhaustion, his power armor's machine spirit struggling to process atmospheric readings that defied every principle of Imperial technology. The angels of death bore scars deeper than flesh, wounds to certainty itself that would never fully heal. They had witnessed transformation and understood that victory over such forces required sacrifices that changed the victors as completely as the defeated. When Mordian asked for his name, Kale felt the syllables form like prayer. Kale, he replied, and the word carried authority no designation had ever possessed. Sister Mariana lay where she had fallen, her body strangely peaceful despite the knife protruding from her side. The ground around her had begun to show impossible signs of life, small shoots pushing through toxic soil, nourished by whatever essence had been drawn from her in final sacrifice. She had traded humanity for miracles, and in the end she had paid in full, becoming a silent monument to compassion's cost in a universe that demanded only sacrifice. Lieutenant Colonel Voss had no grave that could be found. In chambers where his final decision had torn conduits and silenced engines, only scorch marks remained in the approximate size and shape of regret. He had chosen to wound the demon prince rather than risk total catastrophe, understanding that some victories required accepting partial success rather than courting absolute destruction. His sacrifice had been complete, a final stand against power that promised liberation but delivered only deeper servitude. Foreman Kellis rested beneath a tarpaulin that rose and fell with movements too small to be called breathing. His face bore the peace of a craftsman who had finally completed work that consumed his existence, tools scattered around him like offerings at an altar to industrial devotion. The weapons he had modified with impossible expertise lay silent, their enhanced performance reduced to cooling metal and fading energies. The fortress monastery stood as a broken tooth against the horizon, its walls cracked but not fallen, holding within their embrace ashes of ambitions that had consumed millions. Deep beneath its foundations, conduits hummed with residual energies that would never again obey purely imperial control. The transformation was incomplete yet permanent, ensuring Vrax would never again be merely another munitions world, serving the Imperium's appetite for warfare. Princeps Majoris Korath felt consciousness slowly separating from the Imperator Bellicose, as neural links powered down for the final time, the ancient machine spirit's death cry registering as physical pain. The god machine's sacrifice had opened the breach that allowed Imperial forces to reach the sanctum, yet victory had come at cost that made triumph indistinguishable from defeat. Around the Titan's corpse, tech priests muttered prayers to components that would never again sing hymns of war. Colonel Jerton compiled casualty reports that painted numbers too large for human comprehension, his death core reduced to fragments of their original strength. The mathematics of attrition that had defined their existence no longer functioned according to predictable equations, leaving survivors who possessed something their creators had never intended: the ability to choose their own purposes rather than merely fulfill assigned functions. As transport ships descended through poisoned atmosphere to collect the living and catalogue the dead, the official narrative began taking shape. Victory would be declared because something needed to be declared. Medals would be struck, showing fortresses stylized into obedience, while casualty figures would be reduced to acceptable margins through careful statistical management. The true cost, measured not in lives, but in fundamental transformation of everyone who survived, would remain classified at levels requiring specialized clearance few would ever possess. The evacuation proceeded with efficiency born from 17 years of siege warfare, yet something fundamental had changed in relationships between officers and enlisted, between human and transhuman, between the living and those who had learned to remember their dead. Survivors carried within their consciousness experiences that challenged everything they had been taught about human limitations, transformation, that made mockery of imperial doctrine regarding the relationship between will and reality. Kyle found himself walking beside Captain Mordian, not as inferior to superior, but as survivor to survivor, their shared experience transcending hierarchies that had once defined their interaction. In his pocket, he carried the identification tag that had been his only word for himself, keeping it not from sentiment, but because he had learned that the past does not leave when asked. The bolter's weight reminded him of choices made in impossible circumstances, of transhuman warriors who had shown kindness to manufactured soldiers, of corridors lit by white lamps that had lasted exactly 7 minutes. The fortress exhaled into silence that carried across the scarred landscape, settling into trenches that would fill with rain and craters that would become lakes reflecting poisoned stars. In time, the ruins would become a kind of horizon, the line between what humanity could carry and what it must set down. Those who came here would lower their voices without being told, sensing something in the air that spoke of endings and beginnings in equal measure. As the last transport lifted away from Vrax Prime's surface, Kyle pressed his face to a viewport and watched the world shrink into darkness. The siege was over, yet its consequences would ripple across the galaxy for generations to come. In the ruins below, shadows moved according to geometries that existed partially outside normal space-time, while deep beneath the surface, something waited with the patient appetite of cold iron. Not the demon prince who had been diminished beyond recovery, but the knowledge that transformation was possible, that choices mattered even in the face of cosmic horror. The price of victory had been paid in full, yet what emerged from the transaction was something unprecedented. Survivors who understood that humanity's potential transcended every limitation imposed by those who viewed their lives as expendable resources. They carried within their souls the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victory was simply choosing to remain human in the face of forces that offered transcendence at the cost of everything that made transcendence meaningful. In the growing darkness of Vrax Prime's eternal twilight, the silence deepened into something approaching peace. While among the stars, distant powers took note of what had transpired and began making plans for the next test of humanity's capacity for both devotion and destruction. The siege of Vrax was ended, but its echoes would sound across the galaxy until the last star burned cold, a reminder that even in the grim darkness of the far future, choice remained the most dangerous weapon of all.